The rain came down over the city that evening the way it always does when fate wants to force two strangers under the same roof. Marcus Johnson walked with his collar turned up, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, his boots soaked through from 3 hours spent inspecting a construction site on the edge of downtown. He looked like any tired laborer heading home, a man in his late 30s with quiet eyes and a jacket that had seen better winters. Nobody watching him cross the street would have guessed that his name was known in architectural circles from Chicago to Barcelona, because Marcus never let anyone guess. He preferred it that way. He preferred silence, simplicity, and the small dignity of being underestimated. A few blocks away, Victoria Hayes was fighting her own kind of storm. She had just walked out of a business summit where 300 investors had spent 6 hours debating the future of luxury real estate, and every one of them had wanted a piece of her attention. Victoria was 37 years old and ran a property empire worth billions of dollars. Yet on nights like this, surrounded by flashing cameras and shouted questions about her personal life, she felt less like a chief executive and more like prey. Reporters had been camped outside her hotel for 2 days, hoping to catch a photograph that might explain why the most powerful woman in commercial real estate had never once been seen with a partner. She ducked toward a side entrance instead of the main doors, hoping to disappear before anyone noticed. That was when her suitcase betrayed her. The latch, weakened by years of overpacking and overuse, snapped open in the middle of the sidewalk, spilling silk blouses and a laptop case into a puddle forming from the rain. Victoria dropped to her knees without thinking, scrambling to gather what she could before the cameras down the block turned in her direction. It was Marcus who reached her first, kneeling beside her without a word, scooping up folders and clothing with the calm efficiency of a man who had clearly done hard, careful work with his hands his whole life. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't recognize her face from magazine covers, because Marcus Johnson didn't read magazines about billionaires. He simply saw someone in trouble in the rain and did what seemed obvious to him. Together, they carried her bags the last stretch toward the hotel entrance, the two of them ducking beneath the single umbrella Marcus had produced from his backpack, shoulders nearly touching, both soaked despite it. From a distance, through the glass doors of the lobby, they looked exactly like two people who belonged to each other, the kind of couple returning from a long trip, weary but comfortable in each other's company. Neither of them realized how the picture appeared until they stepped inside, and the young man behind the reception desk looked up with a warm, practiced smile. "Welcome back, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," he said cheerfully, sliding a keycard across the marble counter. "Your suite is ready. We upgraded you to the Palm Terrace level, as requested for your anniversary." Victoria froze mid-step. Marcus opened his mouth to correct the mistake, some simple sentence forming on his tongue about how they had only just met 20 minutes ago in the rain. But before a single word came out, Victoria turned to him with the faintest, most unreadable smile and said only, "Thank you so much." The receptionist beamed, entirely unaware that he had just rewritten the next several days of two strangers' lives with a single sentence. Marcus stood there in stunned silence as a bellhop whisked their bags toward the elevator, and for a moment neither of them moved. He glanced sideways at the woman beside him, this stranger with damp hair and sharp eyes, who had just, for reasons he could not begin to understand, allowed an entire hotel lobby to believe they were husband and wife. She caught him staring and simply shrugged, the ghost of amusement flickering across her tired face, as if to say she was as surprised by her own silence as he was. By the time the elevator doors closed around them, the entire staff of the hotel already believed something that had never been true, and somehow, neither Marcus nor Victoria had said a single word to stop it. Once the doors of the private elevator sealed shut, Marcus finally found his voice, low and careful, the voice of a man raised not to make scenes. "You do know I was just helping you with your bags," he said, glancing at the small gold numbers ticking upward above the door. "I have no idea why he called you Mrs. Johnson, but I promise you, I am not your husband." Victoria let out a short, tired laugh, the first genuine sound of relief she had allowed herself in what felt like weeks. "I know exactly who you are not," she said. "You're the man who saved my blouses from a puddle. I'm the woman who is far too exhausted to explain a case of mistaken identity to hotel staff tonight. Consider it a small mercy, both for you and for me. The elevator opened onto a corridor lined with orchids, and when the door to the suite swung open, Marcus understood exactly why she hadn't corrected the mistake. Champagne rested in a silver bucket beside a card that read, "Congratulations on 10 wonderful years," a phrase neither of them had ever lived, and a table had been set for two with candles already lit, as though the hotel had been anticipating their arrival for hours. Victoria explained quietly, almost apologetically, that she had booked this suite under her assistant's family name months ago to avoid exactly the kind of media attention currently parked outside the building, and somewhere along the way, a clerical mix-up had apparently married her off to a man she had known for less than an hour. She confessed something else, too, something that seemed to cost her more to admit. For nearly 3 years, tabloids had chased every rumor about her private life, publishing invented stories about secret boyfriends, staged photographs implying scandal, entire columns speculating about why a woman so successful remained unmarried. If, for even one night, the world believed she had quietly settled down, the hunger of the press might finally ease, if only slightly. Marcus listened without interrupting, and something in her exhausted honesty struck him as far more human than anything he'd expected from a woman whose face occasionally appeared on the cover of financial magazines he never bought. Still, he told her plainly that he couldn't stay, that he had a life waiting for him across town, ordinary and unremarkable, and entirely his own. But when he glanced toward the door, he noticed the concierge lingering just outside with a bottle of wine and a congratulatory note from hotel management, and he understood that walking out now, undoing the fiction so soon, would create exactly the kind of scene Victoria had been trying to avoid all evening. Victoria noticed his hesitation and offered a compromise instead, her voice softer now, almost pleading in a way that didn't suit the confident woman he'd watched command a hallway of reporters earlier that night. "Just tonight," she said. "One dinner, so the staff doesn't ask questions, and tomorrow this entire misunderstanding disappears as if it never happened." Marcus studied her for a long moment, the rain still dripping from his sleeves onto the hotel's pristine floor, and finally he agreed, though only after they set firm rules between them. No questions about each other's personal lives beyond what either wanted to share freely. No physical affection beyond what convincing appearances required. And when morning came, whatever this strange little performance had been would end quietly, with no explanations owed to anyone. Victoria extended her hand to seal the agreement, and Marcus shook it, both of them fully unaware that this simple handshake was the true beginning of everything that would follow. Dinner arrived not long after, and what began as an obligation slowly softened into something neither of them expected. Marcus, it turned out, possessed a dry, understated humor that crept up on people, delivered so calmly that Victoria found herself laughing before she realized a joke had even been made. She told him about a disastrous business trip to Singapore, where she had accidentally signed a contract in the wrong currency, losing her company nearly $200,000 in an afternoon before catching the error, and Marcus responded with such a deadpan story about a client who insisted his entire mansion be built without a single right angle that Victoria laughed harder than she had in months, covering her mouth with her napkin, as though embarrassed by her own joy. A waiter passing by paused at their table, smiling warmly. "Celebrating an anniversary, I hear? 10 years is no small thing these days." Victoria simply smiled and thanked him again, while Marcus felt heat rise in his face, unused to being folded so easily into someone else's carefully constructed story. Later, when the meal ended, Victoria suggested a walk along the private stretch of beach behind the hotel, insisting the fresh air might help clear the last of the rain from both their heads. They walked in comfortable silence at first, waves rolling gently against the shore, and Victoria found herself watching Marcus more closely than she meant to, noticing how he paused occasionally to study the shape of the hotel's architecture against the night sky, how his eyes lingered on structural details most people would never think to notice. She asked him what he did for a living, and he answered simply that he worked in construction and design, a modest description that told her almost nothing at all. Yet the way he spoke about buildings, about how a well-placed window could change how sunlight moved through an entire room, revealed a depth of knowledge that seemed far beyond ordinary labor. Victoria, who had spent her entire career surrounded by architects with expensive degrees and even more expensive egos, found herself intrigued by a man who spoke with more insight than any of them, yet carried himself with the humility of someone who had never once needed to prove it to a room full of investors. Victoria noticed, too, how differently Marcus treated the hotel staff compared to nearly everyone else she had ever brought into her orbit. He remembered the name of the waiter who had congratulated them on their anniversary, thanked the valet who brought around a golf cart to shuttle them back from the beach, and paused to ask the woman restocking towels near the pool how her evening was going, as though her answer genuinely mattered to him. Victoria, who had grown so accustomed to executives who barely acknowledged the people serving them, found herself quietly studying this small, consistent kindness, wondering how a man could carry himself with such warmth towards strangers while remaining so guarded about his own life. It was, she decided, somewhere between the second and third course of dinner, one of the most attractive things she had ever noticed in another person, more compelling than any of the polished resumes and impressive titles that had crossed her desk over the years. By the time they returned to the suite that night, an unspoken shift had occurred between them, subtle but unmistakable. Marcus slept on the couch, true to their agreement, and Victoria lay awake in the enormous bed, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside, wondering why a single dinner with a stranger had unsettled something in her that 3 years of therapy and countless vacations abroad had never managed to touch. In the morning, when she woke to the smell of coffee Marcus had somehow brewed from the suite's small kitchen, she found herself hoping, quietly, and against every instinct of a woman who never allowed herself to hope for anything without a signed contract attached, that their arrangement might not end quite as quickly as they had promised each other the night before. Over the following days, Victoria's curiosity about Marcus only deepened, because nothing about him added up the way she expected. He spoke fluent French during a phone call she overheard by accident, discussed art history with startling precision while they passed a small gallery downtown, and once corrected a hotel manager's misquote of a famous investment principle without even seeming to notice he had done it. A man who claimed to work in construction should not know so much about markets, aesthetics, and language. And Victoria, whose entire career depended on reading people accurately, began to sense that Marcus Johnson was hiding something far larger than a simple construction job. Whenever she pressed gently, asking what exactly his work involved, or which projects he had built, Marcus would deflect with practiced ease, changing the subject to something about her, turning her own curiosity back on herself, with a skill that told her he had been avoiding this exact conversation for a very long time. She let it go each time, partly out of respect for the privacy rules they had established, and partly because some quiet part of her enjoyed the mystery of him, the rare sensation of not immediately knowing everything about a person the moment she met them. In her world, everyone wanted something from her: a deal, an investment, an introduction. But Marcus wanted nothing at all, and that alone made him unlike anyone she had encountered in over a decade. What Victoria did not yet know was that Marcus Johnson was, in fact, one of the most quietly respected architects working anywhere in the country, a man whose designs had reshaped skylines in 3 different cities without his name ever appearing in a single headline. He had walked away from a prestigious firm 8 years earlier, after growing disillusioned with an industry that valued spectacle over substance, choosing instead to work independently, taking only the projects that interested him, and refusing every opportunity for publicity that came his way. Colleagues who once worked alongside him still spoke of him with something close to reverence, yet Marcus preferred blending into a construction site in old boots rather than standing in a boardroom accepting awards, because fame, in his experience, had a way of making people forget who they were before anyone started paying attention to them. He had his reasons for the silence, reasons rooted deeper than simple modesty. Years earlier, before his career had taken off, Marcus had watched a close friend transform overnight. After achieving sudden success, watched the friendships around that man grow thin and transactional, watched people begin loving the idea of him rather than the man himself. Marcus swore then that if success ever found him, he would keep it separate from the parts of his life that mattered, choosing to be known first as a decent, ordinary man before anyone learned what he had built. It was a quiet, private philosophy, one he had never fully explained to anyone, and certainly not to a billionaire CEO he had known for barely 72 hours. The illusion of their marriage might have remained contained within the walls of one hotel, had a single photograph not changed everything. A guest at the resort, recognizing Victoria, despite her attempt at anonymity, snapped a picture of the two of them walking along the beach at sunset, hands almost touching, heads bent close in quiet conversation. Within hours, the image had spread across financial news sites and gossip columns alike, accompanied by headlines proclaiming that the notoriously private chief executive had finally found love, with speculation running wild about the identity of the mysterious man beside her. Victoria's phone began ringing before sunrise, board members and shareholders eager for confirmation, her publicist frantic for an official statement, and for the first time since the misunderstanding began, the weight of the lie became impossible to ignore. Marcus watched the chaos unfold around Victoria with a growing unease, noticing how her easy laughter from the days before tightened into something more guarded, how she began taking calls in hushed tones behind closed doors. He understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that he had wandered into something far larger than a simple favor extended to a stranger in the rain, and though a part of him had begun to enjoy her company more than he wanted to admit, another part recognized that this fiction, however comfortable it had become, was not something either of them had truly chosen. Standing on the balcony one evening, watching the ocean darken beneath a sky heavy with more rain, he finally told her what he had been thinking for 2 days. "I think this needs to end," he said quietly, "before it grows into something neither of us can walk back from." Victoria said nothing for a long moment, staring out at the water instead of at him, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried an unfamiliar rawness. "I know," she admitted. "I just didn't expect it to feel like losing something." The confession surprised them both, hanging in the humid air between them long after the words had been spoken, and though Marcus had every intention of walking away that very night, something in her honesty made leaving feel like the wrong decision entirely. Instead, he proposed something simpler, something that required no rings and no lies. If they weren't ready to end whatever this was, then perhaps they should stop pretending to be married and start, honestly, as friends. Victoria agreed almost immediately, relief washing visibly over her tired features, and the following day, she did something she hadn't done in longer than she could remember. She canceled every meeting on her calendar, dismissed her security detail for the afternoon, and asked Marcus to show her the parts of the city that never appeared in any tourism brochure. He took her to a small arts district, tucked behind an old railway line, where painters sold canvases from folding tables, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from a bakery that had been family-owned for 40 years. They sat for 2 hours in a cramped, unglamorous coffee shop with mismatched chairs, and Victoria, sipping from a chipped ceramic mug, realized she couldn't recall the last time she had ordered anything without a personal assistant handling the transaction first. Later they wandered through a public library with soaring windows and worn wooden shelves, and Marcus led her toward a quiet corner where sunlight fell across rows of architecture books, some of them decades old, their spines cracked from years of use. He spoke about the buildings pictured inside with such tenderness that Victoria found herself watching his face rather than the pages, noticing how his entire posture relaxed in a way she hadn't seen since their first dinner together. In the park afterward, children ran past them chasing a loose kite, and Victoria sat on a wooden bench beside a man she had known for only a handful of days, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, an unfamiliar and almost frightening sense of peace. For the first time since assuming leadership of her company, Victoria moved through an entire day without a single person asking her to approve a decision, sign a document, or comment on a merger. No bodyguards trailed a discreet distance behind her. No assistant whispered updates into her earpiece. No photographer waited around a corner, hoping to capture something worth selling. She was, for a handful of golden hours, simply a woman walking through a city with a man who made her laugh, and the freedom of that anonymity felt more valuable to her than anything her billions of dollars had ever purchased. Marcus, watching her from across the park bench, understood something about her that afternoon that no financial report could ever have revealed. Beneath the composed, unshakable exterior the world saw in boardrooms and magazine profiles, Victoria Hayes was, quite simply, lonely, and had been for a very long time. That evening, back at the hotel, Victoria made an offhand comment that would unravel everything Marcus had spent years carefully hiding. Scrolling through emails on her tablet, she mentioned a new development her company was reviewing, a striking glass structure recently completed downtown that had drawn praise from critics for its unusual use of natural light. She turned the screen toward him absently, expecting nothing more than polite interest, and watched his expression shift the moment he saw the image. It was one of his own designs, a building he had spent nearly 2 years perfecting, and though he quickly masked his reaction, Victoria's instincts, sharpened by decades of reading people across negotiating tables, caught the flicker of recognition before he could hide it. She said nothing that night. But later, once Marcus had fallen asleep in the next room, curiosity overtook her, and she typed his full name into a search engine for the very first time. What appeared on her screen left her staring at the glow of the tablet for nearly an hour. Marcus Johnson, it turned out, was the reclusive architect behind at least 4 internationally celebrated buildings. A man whose work had been featured in design journals across 3 continents, whose name had been mentioned, always briefly and always without a photograph. In connection with award nominations, he had apparently declined to accept in person. There were no interviews, no public appearances, almost no trace of the private life belonging to a man capable of such extraordinary work, and Victoria realized with a jolt that the humble stranger asleep down the hall possessed more quiet influence in his field than most of the executives who regularly begged for her attention. The following morning, she confronted him gently over breakfast, sliding her tablet across the table with the article already open. Marcus studied the screen for a long moment before setting it face down, exhaling slowly, as though relieved that the secret had finally found its own way out rather than requiring him to volunteer it. "Why would you hide something like this?" Victoria asked, genuine confusion coloring her voice. Unable to understand why anyone would conceal achievements most people spent their entire lives chasing, Marcus considered the question carefully before answering, choosing his words the way he chose materials for a building, with deliberate, unhurried precision. "Because the moment people know what I've built," he said, "they stop seeing who I am. They start seeing dollar signs, opportunities, connections they can use. I wanted you to like the man who helped carry your bags in the rain, not the name attached to a few buildings you might have read about in a magazine." Victoria sat with that answer for a long time, turning it over in her mind, and something about his honesty struck a chord far deeper than she expected. She, who had spent her entire adult life being valued primarily for her company's balance sheet, understood exactly what it meant to wonder whether anyone had ever loved the person beneath the title. In that quiet hotel dining room, something shifted permanently between them. An understanding forged not through grand declarations, but through the simple, mutual recognition of 2 people who had both, in their own ways, been hiding from the world for entirely similar reasons. Victoria found herself thinking, later that night, about how strange it was that a woman who could recite the net worth of nearly every executive in her industry from memory had spent an entire dinner completely unaware of the true scale of the man sitting across from her. She realized, too, that this ignorance had never once made her feel foolish, only grateful, because it meant that whatever she had come to feel for Marcus over the past several days had grown from nothing more complicated than his laugh, his patience, and the careful way he listened when she spoke, rather than from any figure attached to his name. It was, she thought, possibly the first time in her adult life that admiration had arrived before information, and something about that order felt more honest than anything she had experienced in years of carefully vetted introductions arranged by well-meaning friends and colleagues. The peace they had found together did not last undisturbed for long, because the outside world had never stopped paying attention. Reporters, having failed to identify Marcus through the earlier photograph, grew increasingly aggressive in their pursuit, publishing speculative articles that ranged from wildly inaccurate to uncomfortably close to the truth. Board members at Victoria's company, sensing an opportunity to reshape her public image into something more relatable, began pressuring her to address the rumors directly, some quietly hoping the story of a secret romance might boost investor confidence, others genuinely concerned about her well-being after years of relentless scrutiny. Victoria found herself summoned to an emergency meeting with her communications team, who insisted she needed to make a public statement before the story spiraled entirely beyond her control. Inside the company itself, the rumor spread with a speed that surprised even Victoria, who had long grown used to the strange machinery of gossip inside a large organization. Junior employees, she had never personally met, began sending congratulatory notes through the internal messaging system, and one department, apparently under the impression that an announcement was imminent, quietly organized a small gift for her desk, a delicate silver picture frame, waiting to be filled with a photograph that did not yet exist. Her closest advisors, women and men who had guided her through 3 separate corporate crises over the years, seemed almost relieved by the story, several of them privately admitting that they had worried for a long time about how isolated she had become at the top of an organization she had built almost entirely alone. Victoria found their concern touching, in a way she hadn't anticipated, though it also made the weight of the misunderstanding heavier, because disappointing people who genuinely cared for her felt far worse than disappointing strangers who only wanted a headline. Marcus, watching the pressure mount around her, made a decision he hadn't fully thought through before speaking it aloud. He told Victoria that perhaps it was time for him to disappear quietly, to slip out of the city before the press connected every remaining piece of the puzzle, sparing her the complicated task of explaining a relationship that had never technically existed. He began packing the following morning, folding his few belongings back into the same canvas bag he had carried the night they met, and Victoria watched him from the doorway with an expression she couldn't quite name, somewhere between panic and grief. She said nothing to stop him then, uncertain whether asking him to stay was fair to either of them, given everything neither of them had ever properly promised the other. That afternoon, Victoria stood before a room full of journalists at a hastily arranged press conference, her communications director hovering anxiously nearby with prepared talking points, designed to neutralize the rumors entirely. Reporters shouted questions before she had even reached the podium, demanding to know the identity of the man photographed beside her, demanding confirmation or denial, demanding, as they always did, some piece of her private life to sell to the public. Victoria stood silently for a moment, gathering herself, and when she finally spoke, her words surprised everyone in the room, including her own publicist, who visibly stiffened beside her. "I have never confirmed anything about my personal life," Victoria said, her voice steady and clear despite the flashing cameras. "But I also want to be honest with all of you today. I have never regretted allowing people to believe what they believed these past few days." A hush fell over the room, as reporters exchanged confused glances, unsure whether they had just witnessed a confirmation or a denial. Victoria offered no further explanation, stepping away from the podium before anyone could press her further, leaving an entire room of journalists to debate among themselves exactly what her carefully chosen words had meant. Somewhere across the city, Marcus, watching a live broadcast of the press conference from a small television in his apartment, set down the bag he had been packing and sat very still for a long time. His apartment was small and unremarkable, the kind of modest one-bedroom rental most people would never suspect belonged to a man whose designs had reshaped entire city blocks, and the television, an old model with a slightly cracked corner, sat on a bookshelf crowded with design journals and secondhand novels rather than any trophies or framed accolades. He thought about the empty space on his own bookshelf, where nothing personal had ever sat. No photographs, no mementos, nothing that spoke of a life shared with anyone else, and he thought about how easily he could have spent the rest of his years content with that kind of solitude, before a broken suitcase latch had interrupted everything he thought he understood about what he wanted. He thought, too, about the strange asymmetry of their situation, how Victoria had just stood before a room full of cameras and essentially told the truth about her own heart, while he sat alone in a quiet apartment, still deciding whether he had the courage to do the same. It occurred to him, watching her steady expression on the screen, that a woman who negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without flinching had just done something far braver than any boardroom deal, and that if he let this moment pass without answering her honesty with his own, He would spend the rest of his life designing beautiful buildings for other people's lives, while forgetting to build anything meaningful in his own. He arrived at her hotel that evening without calling ahead, still wearing the same worn jacket he had worn the night they met, though this time his hands were empty, carrying no umbrella, no excuse, nothing but the truth. He had finally decided to speak aloud. Victoria opened the door before he even knocked, as though some part of her had sensed he would come. Marcus stood in the doorway for a long moment, searching for words that felt adequate to the occasion. Though he had never been a man who cared for grand gestures or rehearsed speeches, what he finally offered her was simple, unpolished, entirely unlike the elaborate proposals featured in the magazines that occasionally speculated about her love life. "I don't know what happens after tonight," he said quietly. "I don't have a ring, and I don't have some perfect plan for the future. But I know I don't want strangers calling us a couple just because of some mix-up at a front desk anymore. I want it to actually be true." Victoria stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of his words settling over her slowly, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, tears gathered in her eyes without any attempt to stop them. She had built an empire on decisiveness, on never allowing emotion to cloud a single business decision, yet standing in that hallway, faced with the plainest, least polished declaration of affection she had ever received, every carefully constructed defense she possessed simply gave way. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him without saying a word, burying her face against his shoulder the way she had wanted to for days but had refused to allow herself, and Marcus held her there in the doorway, both of them finally admitting, without needing further explanation, that whatever had begun as an accident in a hotel lobby had become something neither of them was willing to let go of. Somewhere down the hallway, a hotel employee passing by paused, just long enough to smile at the sight of them, assuming, not incorrectly this time, that he had just witnessed two people very much in love. A year passed, though to anyone watching from the outside, the changes in Victoria Hayes seemed to have unfolded far more slowly, gradually revealing themselves the way a building takes shape over many careful months of construction. The relentless media coverage that had once dictated so much of her daily life gradually softened, in part because she had grown less afraid of the cameras, and in part because Marcus had taught her, quietly and without lectures, that a life lived fully did not require anyone's approval or explanation. She still ran her company with the same sharp discipline that had built it into an empire, but she no longer measured her worth solely by quarterly earnings reports, and colleagues who had known her for a decade remarked, with quiet astonishment, that she smiled now, in meetings, actually smiled, in a way none of them remembered seeing before. Marcus, for his part, had finally allowed a small handful of his completed projects to be publicly credited under his own name, not out of any newfound hunger for recognition, but because Victoria had gently convinced him that hiding his talent from the world helped no one, least of all the young architects who might one day draw inspiration from his work. When her company announced plans for an ambitious new headquarters intended to anchor the city's skyline for the next 50 years, there was only ever one name on the shortlist for the project, though Victoria insisted, with a laugh, that she had absolutely nothing to do with the selection committee's unanimous decision. Construction stretched across 11 months, and Marcus poured more of himself into that building than into anything he had designed before, understanding, perhaps better than anyone, the strange and quiet symmetry of it all. The structure that would house Victoria's company, the woman who had once let a hotel lobby mistake him for her husband, rather than correct a simple misunderstanding, now stood as a physical monument to everything that misunderstanding had eventually become. When the building was finally completed, a soaring tower of glass and warm limestone that critics would later call one of the most humane pieces of corporate architecture built in a generation, the company organized a grand opening ceremony, inviting shareholders, city officials, and a substantial crowd of journalists eager to document the unveiling. Victoria stood at the entrance that evening, in a deep emerald gown, watching guests pour into the atrium, beneath a soaring glass ceiling, designed to let natural light spill across the lobby floor, exactly the way Marcus had once described to her, in a quiet corner of a public library many months earlier. Marcus arrived beside her, not as a guest, but as the architect of record, his name printed clearly on the program for the very first time in his career. And though the attention made him visibly uncomfortable, he endured it gracefully, understanding that some moments were worth stepping into the light for. During the reception, a reporter who had covered Victoria's company for nearly a decade approached the couple with a knowing smile, notebook already open. "There was quite a story a year ago," the reporter said, glancing between them both. "The whole city thought the two of you were already married, back when this whole thing started with a hotel mix-up. Care to set the record straight, finally?" Victoria laughed softly, the sound warm and unguarded, entirely unlike the careful, measured responses she had once given the press throughout her career. She glanced sideways at Marcus, who returned her look with the same quiet steadiness he had carried since the very first night they met, beneath a single shared umbrella. "They weren't wrong exactly," Victoria said finally, choosing her words with the same deliberate care Marcus once used when discussing the buildings he loved. "They were only a little early." The reporter looked puzzled for a moment, pen hovering above the notebook, until Victoria reached over and laced her fingers through Marcus's hand, holding it up just slightly for the small crowd gathered nearby to see clearly. On her finger, catching the light from the atrium's enormous glass ceiling above them, sat a simple ring, the kind that spoke far more of meaning than of expense. "Now," Victoria added, her voice carrying easily across the hushed room, "nobody's mistaken about anything at all." The crowd erupted into warm applause, champagne glasses lifting in celebration, and Marcus pulled her gently closer, resting his forehead against hers for just a moment, both of them entirely unbothered by the cameras flashing around them for what felt, at last, like all the right reasons. Looking back on everything that had unfolded since that rainy evening outside a hotel entrance, neither Marcus nor Victoria could point to a single dramatic turning point that had changed the course of their lives. There had been no grand declaration in the beginning, no carefully planned meeting arranged by well-meaning friends, no algorithm or introduction designed to bring two people from such different worlds together. There had only been a broken suitcase latch, a moment of simple kindness, offered without expectation, and a receptionist's honest, well-intentioned mistake that neither of them had found the courage, or perhaps the desire, to correct in time. What began as an accidental fiction, a small lie of omission neither of them had truly chosen, slowly revealed itself to be something far more honest than either had expected to find in the other, precisely because it had never been built on performance or pretense in the way most relationships in their respective worlds tended to be. Those who knew them well in the years that followed often remarked on how little either Marcus or Victoria seemed to care about impressing anyone outside the walls of their own home. Dinner parties thrown at their new house, a modest structure by the standards of her industry, but one Marcus had designed with his own hands down to the smallest detail, rarely involved the kind of extravagant displays common among people of their combined wealth and influence. Guests instead remembered warm evenings filled with easy conversation, mismatched furniture salvaged from flea markets, Marcus still visited on weekends, and a hostess who insisted on clearing the table herself rather than allowing staff to handle it. Small habits that revealed exactly how far both of them had traveled from the guarded, lonely people they had been the night a rainstorm first brought them together. Victoria had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from her, and Marcus had spent just as long hiding from people who might want something from him. And somehow, in the strange accident of one rainy night, they had each found the one person who wanted absolutely nothing except their company. Sometimes, the story of two people finding each other does not announce itself with fireworks or grand gestures visible from a distance. Sometimes it begins quietly, almost by accident, in the space of a misunderstanding that neither person feels any particular urgency to correct, because some deeper, unspoken part of them has already recognized something worth protecting. Marcus Johnson and Victoria Hayes never set out to fall in love with each other. They simply allowed a small, harmless mistake to become the truth, one gentle day at a time, until there was nothing left to correct at all, only a life they had quietly and deliberately chosen to build together, brick by brick, much like everything else Marcus had ever created that was meant to last.